You would think, you would hope perhaps that in a year where there is this powerful confluence this weekend of Pesach, Easter and Ramadan, that it would be a time of peace and hope and reconciliation. Sadly and tragically, it's kind of been the opposite. And I, with 2 days of Pesach and now Shabbat, I haven't actually been following it closely other than to know that there's been an escalation of violence on different borders and that Jerusalem had a lot of civil unrest at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and so on. And it's just so sad and so tragic. I often, when there's a confluence of things across the traditions, we often get together and we talk about the links that we have in different faith traditions, different spiritual practices. I remember that wonderful time years ago when the fast of Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, which is a fast day, coincided with the beginning of Ramadan, and there was this call for people all over the world to connect, Jewish communities and Muslim communities, and we had an iftar celebration of breaking of the fast celebration that coincided with the breaking of our fast at the Boulder Islamic Center. And some powerful and lasting connections were made. And outside the Middle East, it seems that those relationships are possible, and those relationships are powerful and give us a sense of great hope. But now, when we see in this time when three faith traditions, the three so-called monotheistic religions, all have some of their most powerful holidays at this same season, and that the opposite has happened. It's heartbreaking, actually. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is how a sense of connection and a sense of rejecting the whole idea of Schadenfreude, so-called, or a sense of retaliation and retribution, is really at the core of Pesach. The whole idea of simcha, of joy, of rejoicing, is not mentioned in any context, biblical or rabbinic, when it comes to Pesach. It's interesting when you think about it, because I think for many of us it's a very joyous time. But the word simcha is really reserved for Sukkot. Zman simchatenu, the season of our rejoicing. And there's something about that festival that is connected very much, very intimately with joy. But Pesach's not actually about joy. It's about celebration. Obviously, it's about celebrating freedom. It's about celebrating the Pesach sacrifice. But the joy is actually tempered in three very significant ways. The first is the fact that Hallel, which you would think, the Psalms of Hallel, these joyful Psalms of celebration and release and redemption of Hallel, you'd think we would sing every single day of Pesach. But as we talked about earlier in the week, and this morning when we actually sung the Psalms of Hallel that Harvey led so beautifully and joyfully, I might add, but that's something about these joyful Psalms. We only read them if you're only keeping 7 days of Pesach, only on the first day. If you're keeping 2 days of Pesach, on the first 2 days. The seventh day of Pesach, which is where we calculate the story, that's where the Israelites actually crossed over the sea, and we read that, and we will be reading that on Wednesday, when we read the Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, the song of celebration of freedom. On the seventh day of Pesach, we only have a half Hallel. And the reason that the rabbis give is because we're not celebrating the fact that so many Egyptians lost their lives and drowned throughout the course of the Exodus. And it's the same idea that is reflected in that famous midrash in Yalkut Shimoni, where the midrash that says the angels at that moment of crossing the Red Sea, they really wanted to celebrate. Yay! Yay us, yay Israelites. And God said, whoa, you're going to sing and dance and celebrate when my creatures have been drowned? And it's an interesting midrash because we've seen throughout the story of the Exodus a pretty harsh theological representation of God as a force that hardens the heart, and this whole idea of God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart, I should say. But these two ritually enacted ideas of tempering our joy on the one hand through, as many of us do, and we probably all have different traditions of it, but when we recite the 10 plagues during our Passover Seder, the whole idea of reducing, taking a drop of our sweet wine or grape juice out of the cup and putting in a plate, a napkin, whatever it is we do, and that tradition is a very ancient tradition that was part of the Pesach Seder, that was saying we are removing some of our joy because those plagues, if we look at them, those 10 plagues, and they've become, like so much in our tradition, sort of infantilized a little bit, Every Jewish gift shop, what Jewish gift shop at this time of year would be complete without plague finger puppets, right? And this idea of teaching the plagues through making them fun. There's nothing fun about those plagues, right? That is a horrific story. It's a horrific story where many innocent civilian Egyptian lives were lost or altered forever through those plagues, right? And we see that. And we see that reflected in the rabbinical tradition, that we reduce our own joy because if in order for us to be free, others have had to suffer, we have to acknowledge that suffering. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, as always, writes so beautifully about this. He says, and there's a third, which is we're never supposed to hate a Mitzri, which comes from the Torah itself. Don't hate the Mitzri, don't hate the Egyptian, because you know what it's like to be oppressed. And so this idea that we talk about so much in our tradition, about this idea of not oppressing the stranger, not hating the other, all of these are reflected somehow in the Passover story. So yes, we're celebrating our freedom, but at what cost? And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, quoting a verse from Mishlei, from Proverbs, which says, "Do not rejoice when your enemy falls, when they stumble, do not let your heart be glad." A prohibition against schadenfreude, he says, and this recalls another passage in the Talmud which talks about those angels that I already mentioned. But the whole idea of celebrating the Exodus is that we are supposed to be celebrating a tradition that does not oppress the other, and especially when we're in a position of power. And it's really hard in our world right now, and I'll come to that in a moment, but when we actually look at the tyranny of Egypt before the plagues, there is the most incredible description and calculation of what actually happened in some of the construction of the pyramids and the store cities and so on that we read about. There's very little, and famously, one of my mentors, Rabbi David Wolpe, who I worked with for 2 years in Los Angeles, a couple of decades ago, on the first day of Pesach, he made a very controversial sermon that said, "I've come to the conclusion that the Exodus never happened," right? And it was like, what? Conservative shul, and his basis was there's never been any archaeological evidence that has been found for a people who were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, right? And so whether you buy that or don't buy that is the lack of evidence, a proof that something never happened. And even if you do, does it matter anyway? Because it's still a central and very important narrative. But what we do know is that Egyptian society, which was, a very, very long surviving civilization, some of the effects of it were unbelievable. And there's another essay in here where Rabbi Sachs talks about the Giza pyramid, which has 2,300,000 blocks of stone in it, and it was built. It was built.
Each weighing over 2 tons.
Right, and it was built during the 20 years of the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, which was 2,545 to 2,525 BCE. And he says that if you actually do a simple calculation, I mean, to me that wouldn't be a simple calculation, but he says that the builders would have had to set one stone in place every 2 minutes for 10 hours each day for 2 decades. You think about the human degradation that has to happen in order to create buildings like that, a building project like that. And we see throughout history, we see this idea where people in power take people who are powerless to build phenomenal buildings and suffer, Sadly, the most recent example was the World Cup in Qatar, where thousands of migrant workers died to build a soccer stadium for the world to watch a World Cup, right? It's not dissimilar to the building of the pyramids or to building the Tower of Babel, right? This idea that people with wealth and power enslave people who are powerless to create, in the cases of ancient Egyptian society, monuments to adorn them as gods, right? I mean, some of the I've never actually been to Luxor or Cairo or any of those places. I'm sure some of you have, but some of those monuments have huge statues 4 times the size of the Lincoln Memorial, just adorning and adulating the pharaohs. And guess who ordered those to be built? The pharaohs themselves. It's not like Abraham Lincoln said, "Can you please build a big memorial of me in Washington, D.C.?" Obviously, he didn't. It was built as an honoring of historical legacy, whereas the pharaohs themselves ordered this, and they were this power and this tyranny. So, we imagine in our narrative that the Israelites were part of that, completely dehumanized, completely subjugated, completely oppressed in so many different ways. And we come out of that oppression, and what are we supposed to do with it? We're supposed to absolutely not oppress and dehumanize and disempower others. That's what the Torah is. The Torah is countercultural in that way. The Torah is saying no. The Torah talks very explicitly about not allowing. If you want to have a king, says our tradition. If you want to have a king, don't do like those other nations have kings. Don't let a king accrue too much wealth. Don't let a king have too many horses. Don't let a king have too many wives. Right? I don't think King Solomon quite got that message. But the point being that kings in the ancient world were symbols of a very, very tyrannical, corrupt power. And Jewish tradition wanted to do something that was totally different. So then we see this Exodus, and we see the rabbinic temperance of the Exodus story saying, we celebrate this story, but we're not actually jumping up and down for joy, because we recognize for us to be free, others had to suffer. Egyptians drowned, and we're not supposed to rejoice in the downfall of our enemies, right? And the angels wanted to dance, and God said, no, these are my creatures too. The whole idea of the Torah, of every human face, as we were talking before when we were talking about God's face being a reflection of the divine face, whoever they are, whatever religion, culture, sexuality, gender, whoever they are, that every single human face is a reflection of God's face, comes way before the story of the Exodus, right? It's almost a primordial idea of creation that humanity is going to be born as a reflection of the divine. So every time any face of the divine is degraded and dehumanized, it's not okay according to our tradition. So it's very hard for us, I think, as Jewish communities all over the world, and I don't want to dwell too much on this because it's been stated and it's obvious in a certain way. But what happens when, in our lifetimes, Jews have got power in a way that we haven't had before? And when we see what is potentially happening in the modern state of Israel, when we see what is potentially happening with decades of, frankly, some dehumanization of other people in order for us to have a Jewish state. And believe me, I'm very much still a Zionist and still believe one day I may make Aliyah and go live in Israel. But it's very scary to see the direction that Eretz Yisrael is moving in. And it just seems like those people, those settlers who perpetrate violence, some of the people who are now got very, very senior positions in the Israeli government. I wish they'd read this essay that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, an Orthodox rabbi, wrote that says so clearly that if anyone Jewish in power is dehumanizing any other human being, then they are completely misreading the Torah and completely misreading the Exodus story. As he puts it, full Hallel on the seventh day, which I talked about, the whole idea of that day that we could, mamish be dancing up and down because we survived, not hating an Egyptian, spilling wine during the recitation of the plague. I talked about all of these. All these are fundamental to the Torah's insistence that our humanity precedes our religious identity. Our humanity precedes our religious identity. And the whole notion, he says, of let the people go, because within that story itself, within the story of the 10 plagues, Pharaoh's advisors, if you remember that part of the story, Pharaoh's advisors say to him, "Can you not see that Egypt has been ruined?" And then Rabbi Jonathan Sachs concludes this piece saying, hate destroys the hater, not just the hated. Hate destroys the hater, not just the hated. To be free, you have to let go of hate. So we're celebrating this Man Cherutenu, this season of our freedom. And what does freedom really mean? Freedom is not just about, yay, we survived, yay, we've got a Jewish state, yay, we are, we can have a powerful Jewish identity. And yesterday morning we studied some really great midrashim about what created Jewish continuity and Jewish survival, about not changing names, keeping the Hebrew language, all of these things that we are deeply, deeply proud of in our Jewish world, deeply proud of the heritage that we have as a Jewish people. But if our Jewish identity is founded on the idea that we are chosen and special and beyond reproach, and that we can always rejoice at the downfall of our so-called enemies, then we're missing the point. Not to say that there has to be justice for hateful acts against us, not that we can be blind to the growth of anti-Semitism in the world, not to ignore the fact that there are indeed enemies on every border who want to destroy Israel. Of course, all of those things are true. All of those things are true. But profoundly, Jewish morality is about not hating the hater. If people hate us, we need to find a way on this day that in the counting of the Omer is Gevura Shebechesed, is this idea of this whole week. This whole week is connected to Chesed, which is loving kindness. And loving kindness can be complicated. Sometimes there has to be boundaries to loving kindness. Sometimes there has to be retribution. Sometimes there has to be justice, of course. People who inflict and incite hatred against us, of course there has to be justice. But our tradition says, hate the sin, not the sinner. Don't write off a whole people because they seem to be perpetrating violence and hatred against us. Find ways to continue to love the other and not abandon this very central and important Jewish idea of not joyfully rejoicing at the downfall of our enemies. So freedom, yes, we celebrate freedom. Yes, we are free and privileged in so many different ways. I think it is my hope and my belief that the United States of America will remain a very safe place for Jews in spite of all of the scary trends that we are seeing, and we can feel great about being Jewish and our Jewish identity. not ignoring the challenges and the dark forces that exist in the world, but that above all we recognize that for us to be free, for us to be privileged, there have been others that have maybe suffered, and we have to have awareness of the humanity and to know that whatever religious identity we have, our primary identity is as human beings. Shabbat Shalom.